is to provide GDP numbers at provisional level. When we get updated figures, we revised the GDP numbers to revised estimates. And then when we are very confident that we have final numbers from all stakeholders, we revise the revised GDP figures to final GDP figures. I must also say that in our computations, particularly in the annexes that we release to accompany our GDP data, we usually have some computational variations and adjustments. And so we are able to tell you what the overall GDP is and also what the non-oil GDP is. That is GDP if you strip off oil. We are also able to tell you GDP at basic prices. That is at the farm gate price. And then also we're able to tell you GDP at purchaser's value. That's when we include subsidies and indirect taxes. So we call it net indirect taxes. And then we are also able to report GDP at current prices. That's what we refer to as nominal GDP. I defined that earlier. And then we report GDP at constant prices. That is GDP when we strip off the impact of inflation, or when we adjust the nominal GDP by inflation. So that's what we refer to as a real GDP. And then we're able to also report on quarter GDP. But because of seasonalities, usually we would make sure that when we are reporting the quarter-on-quarter GDP, we strip off the effect of seasons. And so we have seasonally adjusted GDP. At the same time, we're also able to report on year-on-year GDP. So in terms of the numbers we are releasing today, they would definitely be provisional because they are based on incomplete data. So that as we have some more data, and we can then revise these figures to revised, and then finally it will come to final data. So in the data that we'll be releasing, 2023 quarter 1 to 2021 quarter 4 have been finalized, so full information on them. And the estimates for 2022 quarter 1 to 2024 quarter 4 are revised, which are yet to be finalized. So today's release, which is quarter 1 2025, is going to be provisional. The question that usually arises is, where do we get our data from? We source administrative data from relevant ministries, departments, MMDAs, and also from business establishment. And it's based on these that we're able to compile the GDP figures. Now, the question is, what are the key highlights of the provisional 2025 quarter 1 GDP estimates? Nominal GDP for 2025 quarter 1 was 375.2 billion Ghana cedis. And this increased from the 2024 quarter 1 nominal GDP of 290.7 billion Ghana cedis. Non-oil nominal GDP, which is nominal GDP excluding oil and gas, was 364.3 billion Ghana cedis, up from 278.3 billion Ghana cedis in 2024 of quarter 1. Real GDP for 2025 quarter 1, like I said, this will be the GDP after we have taken the effect of inflation away. And that was 53.5 billion Ghana cedis. And this increased from the 2024 quarter 1 real GDP of 50.8 billion Ghana cedis. I must say that the 2025 quarter 1 real GDP represents a growth rate of 5.3%, up from 4.9% in the same period in 2024, despite the ongoing trade wars and the global uncertainty. So in simple language, the real GDP for quarter 1 of 2025 grew by 5.3%. If you strip off oil, non-oil real GDP for quarter 1 2025 was 51.4 billion, up from 48.2 billion. And in terms of its growth rates, it grew by 6.8% for the first quarter of 2025, compared to 4.3% recorded for 2024 quarter 1. So what this means is that the non-oil real GDP for quarter 1 of 2025 was actually higher than the overall GDP growth rate of 5.3% for the same quarter, meaning that the non-oil sectors are performing much better. So what this means is that but for the negative impact of the oil and gas sector, we would have been growing much higher. And once we stripped off the impact of oil and gas, we are looking at 6.8% growth for Q1. Then we are also able to report on GDP deflator, which is the prices in relation to GDP. And you see that the deflator reduced from 25.5% in the first quarter of 2024 to 23.6% in the first quarter of 2025. Now, let's look at some sectoral decomposition with regards to the GDP numbers. We see that the services sector maintained its position as the largest share of the economy in the first quarter of 2025, with a share of 46.8% to GDP at basic prices, despite a modest dip if you compare it to Q1 of 2024. So in other words, in Q1 of 2024, the share of services was 48.3%, but it reduced to 46.8% in Q1 of 2025. Despite that, that is still constituting the largest share of the economy. Now, still on services, you see that the sector grew by 5.9% and actually contributed the most. In fact, if you look at the contribution of the services to the overall growth, it contributed 2.54 to the overall growth of 5.3% in the first quarter of 2025. So what this means is that services alone contributed almost half of the growth we are seeing in Q1 of 2025. Now, agriculture. Agriculture posted a sharp recovery in 2025 Q1, growing at 6.6%, almost tripling the growth rate of 2.4% recorded in Q1 of 2024. Agriculture contributed 1.4 percentage points to the growth of 5.3% in the quarter. And in fact, the share increased from 22.1% same period last year to 23.5%. So what this means is that there is increase in the share of agric from national output. And then let's look at industry. Industry's growth slowed. In fact, first quarter of 2025, we have industry's growth slowing to 3.4%. And this is slowing from a growth of 6.7% in 2024 Q1. Despite the growth dampening of industry sector, it still contributed positively to the 2025 Q1 growth of 1.1 percentage points. I must say that we look at the sub-sectoral decomposition, but basically the performance we are seeing from industry is largely influenced by a very significant contraction in the oil and gas subsector. Now, this picture shows that apart from industry, all sectors witnessed increased growth in 2025 Q1 compared to 2024 Q1. And you can also see that the non-oil growth was more robust than the overall average GDP growth, as I mentioned earlier. I talked about the shares, and as I mentioned earlier, services had the highest share of 46.8%, followed by industry 29.7%, followed by agric 23.5%. Now, let's look at a comparison of the growth of the sectors to what has obtained in terms of average since 2014, when we did the rebasing. Now you see that since 2014, when we did the rebasing, if you look at the average growth rates, the agriculture sector growth of 6.6% is over and above the average growth rate of 4.6% over the 11-year period by about 2 percentage points. And then if you look at the services, it was also higher than the 11-year average. So industry posted 5.9% growth, and the 11-year average was what? 4.9%. So the same, the overall GDP growth was higher in 2025, quarter one, 5.3%, compared to the 11-year average of 4.4%. And it's even higher when you look at non-oil GDP, growth rate of 6.8% in 2025, quarter one, compared to the 11-year average of 4.4%. So over the period, it is only the industry sector that actually recorded a growth that was lower than the 11-year average growth. So for example, as I mentioned, industry grew by 3.4%, but then the average for the 11-year period was industry grew by 3.4% compared to the average 11-year average growth of 3.9%. Now, let's look at the quarter-on-quarter GDP growth rates. We are talking about year-on-year GDP growth rate of 5.3% for quarter one of 2025. So the good news is not just for the year-on-year, but also the quarter-on-quarter. In other words, if you look at the growth of value added, final value added for quarter one 2025 compared to quarter 4 of 2024, that's the preceding quarter. And then if you strip off seasonal effects, we see that GDP grew by 1.4%. Now this 1.4% is actually higher, slightly higher than what obtained in the same period last year, which is quarter one of 2024 of 1.3%. Again, we also see that the seasonally adjusted quarter-on-quarter growth is actually the highest we have recorded since 2024 quarter 4. Now let's look at GDP estimates for quarter 1 for the agric and its subsectors. Now we see that crops, which constitute about 92% of agricultural value-added production, grew at 9.3%. Grew at 6.7%. That's the crop subsector. And the subsector contributed the most to the growth of the subsectors. For example, it contributed 1.15 percentage points to the overall growth of 5.3% in the first quarter of 2025. Now, it's important to note, as I would explain shortly, that for the first time in many quarters, we saw the cocoa sector, which is a subsector under crops, growing positively, meaning expanding by 3.4%. If you look at previous quarters, they were showing reduction. In fact, they were showing contraction. And so the cocoa sector is bouncing back. Now, if you look at the fishing sector, which recorded the highest growth rate of 6.4%, because it has a relatively smaller weight, its contribution to growth was 0.13 percentage points. Livestock did well as well. It grew by 5.6%, and it contributed 0.14 percentage points to the overall growth of 5.3%. Forestry and logging actually recorded the lowest growth under the agriculture sector, as it grew by negative 2.5%, meaning that it contracted by 2.5% in 2025 quarter one. And this actually contributed to a drag on growth. So in other words, it dragged growth by 0.02 percentage points. Now let's look at the dynamics of the fishing sector. As I mentioned, the fishing sector grew the most. And if you look at the trend, you would realize that it shows a strong comeback of the sector, marking the highest growth since 2022 quarter two. Because the growth year we posted for quarter one of 2025 was 16.4. And if you look at the data, you realize that the highest before the 16.4 was the 26.2% that was posted in quarter one of 2022. Next. Let's look at forestry and logging, where the sector contracted. Now, you see that though there's contraction of the sector by 2.5 percentage points in the first quarter of 2025, I must say that the contraction is an improvement over previous periods. So for example, the contraction of 2.5% in the first quarter of 2025 actually shows significant improvement from the contraction of 2.8% in quarter one of 2023 and 7% in quarter two of 2023, 9.9% in quarter three of 2023 before we saw some improvement, and then there was a dip again in 2024 quarter two. And then since then, we are seeing some improvement to a contraction of 2.5% in 2025 quarter one. Now, cocoa sector, as I mentioned, cocoa sector grew by 3.4% in the quarter. And this is a significant improvement over the performance we've seen in previous quarters. In fact, it's the highest growth we've seen in the sector since quarter three of 2023. Now, let's look at the industry sector. As I mentioned earlier, the industry sector grew by 3.4%. And this growth was dominated by manufacturing. So in fact, manufacturing is doing the job there. Manufacturing grew by 6.6% in the first quarter of 2025 under the industry sector. And it contributed 0.81 percentage points to growth. Electricity also expanded by 2.8%. And then mining and quarrying also expanded by 1.4%. We also saw some expansion in construction, which picked up in terms of growth to 1.5% in the first quarter of 2025. Now, oil and gas production, which is a subcomponent of mining and quarrying, contracted by 22.1%. So, but for oil and gas contraction, we would have seen mining and quarrying actually performing way much better. And later, I would explain that part of the reasons why we are seeing a positive growth of the mining and quarrying sector in spite of the negative growth of the oil and gas sector is the performance of gold. In fact, you see that gold actually performed well in the first quarter of 2025. Now, this shows the growth path of manufacturing over the period. And what we see here is that manufacturing has really picked up strongly from a negative 7.4% in the third quarter of 2022 when the sector actually contracted. And then it even contracted even more to 9.6% in 2022 quarter four, to now a positive 6.6% expansion in the first quarter of 2025. Now let's look at water and sewerage. As I mentioned earlier, water and sewerage also contracted. So we are looking at a contraction of 3.7%, meaning that it registered a negative growth of 3.7%. And if you compare that to the first quarter growth of 7.6%, this was really a very disappointing performance. Oil and gas. As I mentioned earlier, we saw a negative growth of 22.1%, or a contraction of 22.1%. And this, compared to quarter one of 2024 of an expansion of 16.1%, is actually a very disappointing growth. And it was the main driver of the industry growth downwards in the first quarter of 2025. I mentioned earlier that gold did better in the first quarter of 2025 as it grew by 5.6% compared to the previous quarter contraction of 2.2%. Now, even if you look at the first quarter of 2024, the 5.6% is a significant improvement of the 1.6% recorded in the first quarter of 2024. That's for gold. Now, let's look at breakdown of the performance of the services sector. The growth in the services sector was dominated by a number of subsectors, including information and communication, which actually registered the highest growth of 13.1% and contributed